Hello and welcome friends. I am Dr. Amit Chawla, Professor, Amity University, Haryana. I am a PhD in Mass Communication, alumni of IIM Kashipur and a qualified trainer from ITC Netherlands. In the last 20 years, I have mentored UG, PG and PhD students of various institutions like NIFT, Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi University, Sharda University, Amity University, GGS IP University and more. I have also been associated with names like Doordarshan, Sahara India, Canon, PIB, SSC, Jagran Group, etc. I have authored and edited 4 books, contributed chapters and articles in 11 books, index journals, etc. and I have also shot thousands of photographs and videos till date. I am also the founder of Photoshala, which is India's first one-stop destination for education, shoots and consultancies related to still photography and video production. In today's episode, I shall be sharing about lights and exposure control in photography. After studying this module, you shall be able to explain the concept of exposure control and differentiate between overexposed, underexposed and correctly exposed photos, practice photography with automatic exposure and various scene modes available in digital cameras including no flash auto, portrait, landscape and sports mode, apply the concept of controlling exposure with aperture, shutter speed and ISO, control movement with shutter speed, noise with ISO and depth of field with aperture, and describe the importance of setting the right white balance as per the light, change the EV compensation on aperture priority, shutter priority and programmed auto modes to set higher or lower exposure than the exposure recommended by the camera's light meter. Light and exposure control. Light and its control are the most important technical elements in photography. If understood well and practiced creatively, it can result in some awe-striking photographs. Controlling the light by various methods to capture a properly exposed image is termed as exposure control. Getting more light than what is required is called overexposure and less light than what is required is called underexposure. This is how over and underexposed photos look like. A light meter reading like this can show if the image is over or underexposed. Exposure of light within any digital camera is measured using a light meter. Now, in some cameras, this light meter can be on the body facing the subject you are pointing at, and in cameras like DSLRs or mirrorless, light meters are placed behind the lens. Such light meters are called through the lens or TTL meters and are mostly described or considered as the most professional way of metering the light. Most amateur, semi-professional and professional cameras allow a photographer to control exposure using exposure mode dial. With this, one can choose the exposure mode that the photographer wishes to select. When shooting on automatic mode, the camera sets the sensitivity of the image sensor, controls the intensity of light passing through the lens and also sets the duration for which the sensor will be exposed with the light on the basis of calculations which are done by this meter. In case the light is too low, it can even send a signal to the flash to automatically fire when the shot is taken. There can be several automatic scene modes which can be used by photographer as per the specific situation in which the image is being shot. For example, in no flash auto, exposure will be controlled automatically, but the flash will not fire. In automatic portrait scene mode, the mode of the camera optimizes the exposure settings for photographing portraits by trying to blur the background and smoothing the skin tones. In the landscape mode, the photographs shall be optimized for shooting vibrant colors and sharp details of landscape scenes. Similarly, in action or sports mode, multiple shots at fast shutter speed are taken automatically by the camera with a view to freeze the action or a moving subject. There can be several more automatic or semi-automatic scene modes available in that will vary from camera model to model. However, it is important to note that automatic exposure is done by the camera on basis of some predefined set of rules and may not apply in all lighting and subject situations. That is the reason why you may not get the most accurate results in automatic modes. For more professional photography, you need to understand the manual exposure modes. The M mode on this dial stands for the manual exposure mode, where the entire control is in the hands of the photographer. On the other hand, aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode and programmed auto mode are semi-automatic exposure modes that offer some control to the user, while others are set within the camera. However, it may be interesting to know that exposure control is not all that difficult even on a manual exposure. Here is a demo of the light meter showing overexposed, correctly exposed and underexposed images. So, if you see on the screen in the menu of the manual mode, here this one is the light meter reading, and if it is showing right in the center, it means that the exposure is correct, like this. This is the right exposure, where the light meter was right in the center. In the second shot that we are going to take, we are going to underexpose the image, where the light meter is showing that the meter reading is at -2 or -3. If I take the shot right now, what is going to be the result is going to be a dark shot or an underexposed shot, something like this. This is an example of underexposed shot. In the next shot, we are going to take an overexposed shot. If the camera meter tells you that it is overexposed by 2 or 3 stops and then you take the shot, it is going to be a much brighter image, it is going to be a whiter image than otherwise. That is called overexposed shot, like this. This is an example of an overexposed shot. For setting the right exposure, your attempt that should be that the reading that is in the camera light meter should be in the middle of the frame, which is something like this. This is an example of perfect exposure. Exposure control is dependent primarily on 3 factors: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Let us understand these one by one. Aperture. Aperture is the opening within the lens that controls the intensity or the amount of light passing through. It is like the pupil in our eye, which closes or opens as per the amount of light present around us. Aperture is calibrated in ratios called f numbers. Smaller the f number, larger the aperture opening to allow more light, and of course vice versa. For example, aperture of f by 5.6 allows double the light than f by 4 and half the light as compared to f by 8. Every time you cut the light by half or double it up, it is called decreasing or increasing the light by 1 stop. A typical f number scale looks something like this. Other than the light, aperture also controls something called depth of field. Depth of field is a range of distance within which the background and the foreground of your subject would look sharply focused. Large f numbers will result in wider depth of field, and thus large range of your frame may look sharper. On the other hand, a small f number will result in the background and foreground of your subject getting defocused. On aperture priority mode or manual mode, when the aperture is set to a lower f number, you would see that the depth of field becomes very shallow. I will take a shot to demonstrate this to you. Right now, the shot is where I have got this bunny in front of my camera and there is another toy in some distance. When I take the shot, the bunny, which is my primary focus, shall be in focus and the other toy will be out of focus. Let us see. Here, if you notice, the bunny's eyes and the bunny is absolutely sharply focused. However, the other toy which is in the background is slightly defocused. This is called shallow depth of field, which is achieved by a smaller f number. To increase the depth of field or to achieve everything in sharp focus, I need to increase the f number. Here I am going to change my f number from f 4.0 to f 16 or f 32, f 22. At f 22, the depth of field is going to be very high. Now, right from the bunny to the background, everything is going to be in sharp focus. Look at it. In this shot, which has been taken with aperture f 22, right from the bunny to the other toy in the background, everything is in sharp focus. This is called high depth of field. By changing the aperture, we can also change the intensity or the amount of light which enters into the camera. If I kept the aperture number at 4.0, you would see that the camera meter is showing to me that the light is appropriate. If I keep the f number at f 16 or f 22, it would show me that the light is underexposed. At this moment, if I take the shot, there is going to be a dark shot like this. This is an example of an underexposed shot which has been taken with an f-stop at f 20. Now, I am going to change the f-stop to f 4.5 or 4 and see what is the result. Let us take a look. This shot has been taken with an aperture set at f 4.0. That makes it very clear that keeping a lower f number will give you more light and keeping a higher f number will give you less light or an underexposed shot. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is the second factor with which one can vary the exposure. Shutter curtain blocks the light to expose the imaging sensor until the photographer presses the shutter release button. When the actual shot is taken, shutter opens for a brief duration and then closes back to its original position. The duration between which the shutter curtain opens and closes back is called the shutter speed. It is measured in the units of time, that is seconds. A typical shutter speed scale is something like this. It is measured in the units of time, seconds. A typical shutter speed scale is something like this. Fast shutter speeds like 1 by 1,000th of a second lets in light for a very short duration. Other than limiting the exposure, it also results in freezing the fast action as demonstrated. On the other hand, slow shutter speed results in motion blur, with which you can create creative shots like light painting, streaks of light or even zoom burst. To demonstrate shutter speed and what it can do, I have a toy with a moving part. Now, if I keep a fast shutter speed, the movement will be frozen, and if I keep a slow shutter speed, the movement will be hazy. Let us take a look. Here I am using a shutter speed of 250th of a second. At 250th of a second, you see that there is some movement of the toy in the frame. In this shot, I have kept the shutter speed at 1 by 1,000th of a second. Let us take a look what happens. one which is taken with 1 by 1,000th of a second exposure and another one which is shot at 1 by 250th of a second of exposure, you can very well notice that at 1 by 250th of a second there is a haze or a blur in the photograph, while at 1 by 1,000th of a second, the next photograph, there is absolutely no shake, no blur in the toy. This one has been taken with 1 by 1,000th of a second and this photograph has been taken at 1 by 250th of a second. Let us try and decrease the exposure, let us try and increase the time of let us now try and increase the duration of exposure even more. Let us now keep the exposure at 1 by 10th of a second or 1 by 5th of a second and see what happens. Here is a picture shot at 1 by 10th of a second. If you compare this with a shot at 1 by 1,000th of a second, the difference should be very apparent. This one is frozen, while in this shot there is a lot of haze that you see, the movement that you see in the picture. ISO. Instead of controlling the intensity of exposure or time of exposure, ISO determines how much light the sensor or the film would need for an appropriate exposure. In other words, ISO is a measurement of the sensitivity of the sensor or film towards light. With higher ISO number, the medium becomes more sensitive towards light, thereby requiring lesser quantity of light for appropriate exposure. However, with higher ISO numbers, the image tends to become more grainy, sometimes also called noise, and that can mean compromising on quality. Firstly, I am going to take a shot with ISO set at 100, and in the next shot I am going to take the same shot with ISO kept at 6400. The first shot now that I am going to take is at 100 ISO. Let us see. This is a shot taken at 100 ISO. The next shot that I am going to take is going to be the shot at ISO set at 6400. The second shot that I am going to take is at 6400 ISO. Now, this is a shot taken at 6400 ISO, and if I zoom in and want to see, it is pretty evident that there is a lot of noise which is visible in the picture, while in the last shot which was taken at 100 ISO, there is no noise. There is too much noise in the shot taken at 6400 ISO, and in the shot taken at 100 ISO, I can't see any noise. Right exposure is achieved by getting the right combination of aperture, shutter and ISO. Together, they constitute exposure triangle. Have a careful look at this diagram. The EV or the exposure value scale in most cameras indicate if the exposure value overall is correct, under or overexposed. Let us do it and see how to set the right exposure through aperture, shutter speed and ISO with different type of subjects. Let us now see that how the aperture, shutter and ISO make the exposure triangle. With the help of aperture, shutter and ISO, which can be controlled with the manual exposure on the exposure mode dial, you would see that changing the shutter speed from 1 by 1000 to now 1 by 500 or maybe 1 by 250th of a second, I can control the exposure. Similarly, I can also change the exposure by changing the aperture, which was earlier at f4 and now it is set at f11. Similarly, I can also change the exposure by setting the ISO at different speeds. Right now, I am setting it at 100 and you can see that it is an underexposed shot that the camera meter is telling you. If I wish to change, I can also increase the time of exposure from 1 by 250th of a second to say 1 second or 2 seconds and see that the exposure has come in the middle. If I do not want to change the time or the duration of exposure, I could have also kept the exposure time at say 1 second or half a second, and I could have increased the intensity of light by opening up the aperture to f4. Now you would see again the light meter is showing that it is in the center. Instead of changing the exposure with aperture or shutter, I could have also set the ISO to manipulate the exposure. Let us look at it. Now I am going to keep the aperture at f16 and I am going to increase the ISO from 100 now all the way to 25,600, and take a look, now it is overexposed image. Now if I increase the time or rather decrease the time to 1/60th of a second, you see that again the exposure has been set to the correct exposure here. So by now you must have understood that by changing the aperture, shutter and ISO, which make the exposure triangle, you can manipulate the exposure, which is the part of exposure triangle. White balance. While exposure is controlled inside of a camera by setting the ISO, aperture and shutter speed, you can also control the color of image by understanding white balance. White balance is a process of removing unrealistic color casts in the photographs. These casts appear as a sources of light like sunlight, light bulbs, tube light, flashlight, etc. do not emit pure white light. Each of these have a color temperature which is measured in Kelvin scale. Here is a chart that shows approximate color temperature and shade of each light source. Human eye and brain coordination is such that it can quickly adjust to different color, temperature and changing shades of light. However, in a camera it needs to be set. If the white balance is set to auto, the camera picks up the reference points within the shot and sets an average range that closely matches the color temperature chart shown below. Human eye and brain coordination is such that it can quickly adjust to different colors by changing shades of light. However, in a camera it needs to be set. If the white balance is set to auto, the camera picks up reference points within your shot and sets it to average range that closely matches the color temperature chart shown. However, setting it manually avoid any chances of accidentally getting a wrong white balance or a color cast. Look at these two images carefully to understand it better. However, if you are shooting a photograph in RAW format, you always have an option of correcting the white balance during the processing stage of your image in editing software like Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop that supports RAW imaging processing. In case you are not shooting on RAW, or if your camera does not support the RAW format, you may set your camera's white balance as per the presets given in the chart. Let us try and set white balance ourselves with different lighting situations. EV compensation. EV stands for exposure value. Usually, the camera meter attempts to achieve an average of 18% grays, which is accepted as correct exposure. However, sometimes if the photographer intentionally wants to over or underexpose a photograph, the exposure compensation value can be an option. This grayscale showing EV compensations between minus 2.5 stops to plus 2.5 stops attempts to explain this. Here, by increasing or decreasing the EV compensation value, the photographer instructs the camera to electronically brighten or darken the image. This works in aperture priority, shutter priority and programmed auto modes. EV compensation does not work in manual mode, because here the exposure values are manually adjusted using aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Let us learn this with the help of a demonstration. Summary. In this episode, we discussed that exposure control is manipulating light in a camera by various methods to capture a properly exposed image. While the idea is to achieve a correctly exposed image, getting extra light than required is called overexposure and less light than what is required is called underexposure. In most cameras, exposure is controlled using exposure mode dial, in which we learnt that there are many automatic and scene modes like portrait, landscape, sports mode, etc. that can be applied as templates to achieve the right exposure as per the given situation. For more exposure control and professional looking shots, aperture priority, shutter priority and programmed auto modes with full manual exposure modes also are available on these exposure mode dials. Further, we learned that how opening and closing of aperture, which is like the iris in our eye, controls the intensity of light entering the camera. We also learned that wider aperture openings or smaller f numbers result in shallow depth of field and vice versa. Similarly, using fast shutter speed or shorter duration of exposure will freeze the action, and keeping higher ISO can result in a noisy image. We also practiced altering the white balance to achieve or remove warm or cool tones in an image, either by using presets or by changing color temperature. Finally, we also learned that by increasing or decreasing the EV compensation value, one can brighten or darken the image on aperture priority, shutter priority and programmed auto modes. Conclusion: as we come to the end of this episode, I am confident that now you should be able to explain the concept of exposure control and differentiate between overexposed, underexposed and correctly exposed photos. Practice photography with automatic exposure and various scene modes available in digital cameras, including no flash auto, portrait mode, landscape mode and sports mode. Apply the concept of controlling exposure with aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Control movement with shutter speed, noise with ISO and depth of field with aperture. Describe the importance of setting the right white balance as per the light. Change the EV compensation on aperture priority, shutter priority and programmed auto modes to a higher or lower exposure than the exposure recommended by the camera's light meter. I sincerely hope that you found this session useful and informative. With this, we conclude this episode on light and exposure control. That's all for today. Goodbye.